Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for your interest and your curiosity about more about the Journey Home, Portraits of Healing. Welcome to this little chat that I am having with Michael Rost, the author of Journey Home, Portraits of Healing. My name is Charles Hubbell, and I'm the audiobook narrator. And with me today is Michael Rost. He's using Gabriel as his pen name for the authorship of the book. But here is Michael, and we're just going to talk about the book and maybe ask some questions that you would probably ask us, and we'll ask it of each other, and hopefully give you a little more insight into the production of this book. So, Michael, let's just start right away. We were talking just before we started the recording of this little podcast, audiocast. We were talking about the possibility of you doing a blog. And what hit me right away is that this book seems to be more of your human experience, your emotional experience of dealing with the progression that your parents went through. Whereas I wonder if maybe doing a blog about this as an industry or as a facet of our society would have to incorporate maybe certain medical progress in the area or what certain programs are going on. And I'm not sure that's really what you would be into or what.
Well, no, I think, you know, as a narrator of the book, you've seen it all very close and personal, what the story is. I mean, essentially, when both my parents started experiencing signs of dementia, it became clear to me and my siblings that our lives were changing radically, that normal systems of communication and normal systems of relationships were now being upended, and we had to reinvent basically what our family was, because sort of the glue was sort of melting away. And so, you know, people have asked me questions about caretaking, you know, caregiving for elders undergoing dementia or Alzheimer's. And I tell them that, you know, I'm not a medical expert. I mean, I learned a lot about the medical treatment aspect of it. But what I tried to do in this book, The Journey Home, was sort of describe this reinvention of the son-parent relationship that was inevitable. I mean, I had two choices: either reinvent the relationship or run away from the relationship entirely. Yeah. And I think, you know, I meet a lot of people who just run away and just say, well, it's over, put them away in some care facility and maybe visit once every month or so and call it a life, you know. But I wanted to explore it a little more, partly, well, you know, I think children don't want to let go of their parents. They want to try to understand them up until the very end, because that's part of the entire relationship. So in terms of starting a blog, for example, I would have to do it from the point of view of how does a person just honestly deal with the barriers that are in front of you when you're, you know, on this so-called journey of, you know, the end of life.
Well, I understand the inquiry and the offer or trying to push you to do a blog, because I have to compliment you on your writing. I find that you are a wise, creative, thoughtful, heartfelt writer, and it was very interesting for me as a narrator to bring life to the words in an audio file, but just to read your work is poetic and lovely. And so I understand why somebody would say, hey, why don't you do some more writing, because they love your writing. But why would you feel that maybe doing an audiobook version of your narration, why did you think that was important for this story?
Well, you know, I'm sort of grounded in literature. I'm a professional linguist, study, you know, languages and language acquisition and language loss, for that matter. But I think all stories are essentially oral. They're essentially one person spontaneously producing what they remember at a moment to a listener. It's essentially a one-on-one relationship, the reader and the author, or the listener and the author. Yeah. And, you know, I think that the ultimate form of storytelling is oral. And so I was convinced from day one that I wanted an audio version. And I think I shared this with you, Charles, at an earlier point in our relationship, that I did some of the recording myself at my own desk, kind of a home studio thing. And to my surprise, I wasn't able to narrate the story in the way that I felt it in my heart. I mean, I was stumbling over stuff and winding up with multiple takes on phrasings, and I would finish and I would think, oh, this isn't exact, so I'm not a professional orator, as it were. I feel very comfortable that I've spoken the story in a written form. And then I audition professional narrators like yourself, and it's kind of embarrassing, but I have about 20 audition files. And, everybody was a professional. Everybody I auditioned did it, quote, professionally, meaning, great voice, great inflections, etc. But until I met you through your audition, I didn't feel that anybody was telling the story in the same sort of voice that I felt was coming from my own heart. And that is really a question of maybe pacing, and a question of feeling each nuance of the story, which, is I think I mentioned this to you, I consider it a kind of storytelling is a mindful act, that you have to kind of savor each phrasing, each event, not just each event or each chapter, but, each phraseology that comes into the story. You have to enjoy telling it as well. And I felt that in your voice, that this is a difficult story to narrate, I believe, because I tried it myself. But at the same time, you do enjoy, do you not, the act of the storytelling?
I do enjoy the act of the storytelling, and becoming an audiobook narrator is a great joy for me because I like the long form nature of voiceover. But I also feel it feels very natural to have come to this point in my audiobook narration evolution, where I have started to slow down. I've started to sit inside the story. And your book came to me at a time when that is really settling into my own style, professionally, personally, sitting in the story, letting the words really do the work. And there were so many times in the story where I would get caught up in the emotion of it, because it was easy to put my parents in the role of your parents and my human experience compared to your human experience, and the feelings that you have for your father, for your mother. It was easy to access that, and the empathy was there, and the same feelings I have for my parents. I wanted things to land. I wanted phrases to be heard and then to be affected by those. And a lot of that is pretty much the same as it is to be an actor on stage or an actor on film. I want to have a dialogue with another actor, and I want their words to land on me, and you as a viewer would see that land on me, and vice versa. But the same is true audio-wise. There is a pacing and a space and a silence in which a certain amount of reflection can happen, where we understand that in a normal human dialogue or in a normal human day, we take things in and soak them in sometimes with time and patience. There are some elements in life where things move very fast, and there are some times that we want things to slow down. Certainly in my mind, when I reflect back on the memories of my parents, I do want to sit for a while and be in that moment. So again, this was a pleasure. It was a different kind of book than the stuff I've done before. I mean, I did audiobooks for, say, the Wizard of Oz books that I did, or some high fantasy novels and things like that.
I've heard some of those samples, and they're brilliant. And I think what you're describing is that, I only briefly studied the Stanislavski Method in college. The idea of embodying the character. And the idea of you don't speak your lines, you let your lines land on the person you're talking to. and then see how they respond before your next offering. And that by its nature takes more time. And I did notice, I mean, to go back to the auditions for a second, that a lot of the audition actors were trying to get through it. And my sense was, why are you in such a rush? Well, I understand the pressure on acting. You know, you don't get most of the auditions you go for. But at the same time, you know, if the overall message is, I'm just trying to rush to get to the end of this chapter, you know, the idea of letting your language land on the listener, letting your message, your vocalization of the story land on the listener before you continue, you know, I think you're going to miss the whole pacing aspect and the whole essential or storytelling aspect of it if you're just rushing to narrate the words.
And
So,
my journey is to become more comfortable with myself, more comfortable with my voice, and more comfortable with storytelling. And in that comes a slowing down. So there is a confidence aspect. I can't comment on other audiobook narrators, but I certainly understand about myself, just to be vulnerable, that when I first started out in audiobook narrating, I was also reading quite fast. I think it's just because of the lack of confidence in telling the story. Surely I'm talking too slowly. You know, surely somebody's getting bored by this time. When my wife listens to a audiobook by Neil Gaiman, she does it, you know, in twice as fast. She pushes that little button so that Neil talks even faster. So I'm aware that there are people that like to listen to audiobooks and turn up the speed on them.
turn up the speeds.
And if they want to do that to me and you, okay, that's fine. But let's take our time with this.
Yeah, I think with this kind of story, you don't want to turn up the speed. Although, you know, I've experimented with it on Audible. You know, you can go up to, I think, 2 or 2.5% speed, where you're literally like speed listening. If you're just trying to get through, say, a manual on how to, you know, repair a pipe, that might be what you want to do. But storytelling is meant to be savored, I believe. And there's no need to rush through. I mean, one of the things that I was intending in this particular novel / memoir is that it consists of 35 episodes, or you know, what are we calling them? Vignettes, episodes. That it is a continuous story chronologically, but you can dip into number 17 and then number 3 and then number 32 if you wish. And that each episode is intended to stand alone as a storytelling event. And I really do believe that good storytelling isn't dependent on the sequence, that you can literally dip into a good novel or a good audiobook, you know, at just one segment of it. I mean, a chapter or an episode obviously makes sense to have it bookended by something cohesive.
Yeah.
And in this story, we did that with music, right? That we had a music lead in, and then the episode, and then a music lead out. And I was intending for each of those to be its own story. You know, for example, one of them, I was just listening to refresh my memory just before we started talking, was, you know, the inheritance episode, where I go with my father to the cafe where he grew up, on the second floor of the cafe that his father owned. And, you know, he had been resistant to wanting to go back to visit it. He hadn't been there for 40 years, even though it's in the same town that he had lived in. And because it represented some memories that he didn't want to scratch into again. You know, I think everybody has had a difficult childhood in some way or another. And, you know, he growing up in the Depression and, you know, going off to World War II, and, you know, that whole drama, and coming back home and his father wanting him to take over ownership or responsibility for the cafe. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm reinventing my life. I think we all have these reinvention episodes, redirects in our lives. And that always rubs against our family values in some way or another. And I think for my father, it was the cafe represented that conflict. And he didn't want to go back to visit it. But that event of us going back to the cafe, even though it only took like a 20-minute visit, to me, that encapsulates a story. And you don't need to read what came before that or after that in order to have that as a meaningful storytelling experience. And I think our lives are full of these types of experiences that stand alone. I mean, they're obviously in the sequence of our lives, but they stand alone. And if we can explore each of those moments with slowness, as you were saying, you know, savoring it, and we find meaning in that, I think that's the meaning of life, to tell the truth, you know, is savoring those rich experiences that are multi-layered, you know, and we have to be present to experience those different layers.
Right.
Beyond just the time of what happened, you know, just
Right.
the physical event, because experiences happen at multiple levels. And I think a good storyteller like yourself, you know, can let the story listener into these different layers.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that we talked about in the production of this audiobook was I do have various dreams that occurred during this 2 or 3 year period when I, you know, in the final years of their lives, my parents' lives. And I remember these dreams very vividly, and I think they had meaning to how these events were unfolding. And so I wanted to include them in the story. My editor at the publishing house, you know, convinced me, maybe rightly, to, you know, to eliminate a few of them, because some of them were darker and more ambiguous than others. You
So
know.
there were dreams that you had written out that you have left, left
Yeah.
out?
Yes, I left out a couple. I mean, they're still in, you know, the first draft, an earlier draft. And, you know, I think a good editor will do that for you. You know, they'll give you a perspective that you can't see from the first person, you know, writing perspective, that would just distracting, you know, that they wouldn't, to create a cohesive story, you do have to leave certain things out.
Of course, yeah. But these dreams, although they had a meaning, they for me they seem to, and I'd like to hear your interpretation on this, but they seem to color the chapter with and enhance it with a color or a mood rather than say some sort of symbolic meaning. This means that, and my father is represented by this in the dream. It didn't really have a direct parallel to the story, but it did seem to color it and leave us in a certain mood as we went into from the dream into reality. Can you talk about why you had the dreams? And you would start off a few chapters with the dream, and then you would move into reality.
Yeah, I think ultimately I decided on 4 dreams to keep.
4 dreams.
And like, you know, for example, one dream was the Dissection Dream. It's not a very pleasant dream on the surface, but it involved a dissection of a person, my mother, you know, and it was sort of like a magical realism type of dream. And I think magical realism is one tool of storytelling where you just enhance the story with magic, stuff that couldn't happen. But dreams give us that every night. You know, they introduce some kind of magic or some kind of configuration that couldn't occur in the real physical world. So this particular dream was the day before I visited my mother after she had been admitted to the nursing home. This was the first time I'd gone back to Cincinnati, where the story takes place, to visit her. And literally on the morning that I was to visit her, the night before, I had this dream of the dissection. And the meaning of the dream, and I think it comes out in the narration, is that she gives me permission to see her and take her apart. But as I take her apart, each of her dissected parts is illuminated with light. And I didn't know what the dream meant, other than it was vivid and it was powerful. But I somehow felt in retelling the story of, okay, I went to visit my mother at the nursing home for the first time, that the prelude of having the dream allows the reader and the writer actually to realize that there are things in our subconscious that are part of our experience that we don't fully understand. But I think bringing them into the story helps us accept, you know, these, in a way, you know, the subtitle of the book, Portraits of Healing, I came upon this kind of late in the day, but every experience in this book involves some sense of loss. Something is being lost in the relationship or in physical capability. But each loss presents as an opportunity to kind of heal and grow and transform in a different way that we didn't have opportunity to do before. So in that sense, these difficult experiences are actually opportunities and gifts on some level for us to heal parts of ourselves that we didn't know were in need of any healing, And so that's why I included the dreams. They all involve some element of healing or some element of loss or brokenness that needs to be healed. And ultimately, the story is intended to be a healing story. It's not meant to be a tearjerker or let me drag you through this sadness. That's not the point. The point is, I think, to show different ways of healing brokenness or loss or confusion even.
Did you comprehend the feeling? Did you comprehend the healing right away?
Or absolutely not.
Is the book more of a reflection of how the healing took place without you really knowing it? Or did the healing take place years later? How many years was it where you wrote the book, between your experience and when you actually wrote the book?
Well, that's I think the key element of the story is how long the healing does take, or that it doesn't take place instantaneously. I mean, I'm trained as a linguist, and during the 3-year window where the events in the story happened, I had, when I went to visit, I would keep tape recordings and journals, and I had a lot of notes and sketches and just things I knew that I wanted to recreate later. So it wasn't until 7 or 8 years later, after my parents had actually passed away, that I started putting the story together. I don't think I was ready before that time. I think I was full of imagery and I was full of feeling, of course, but it didn't have a sense of closure. And interestingly, people, even in my own family, often do not want to talk about these events because they may not have closure, and we don't need closure on everything in our lives. And a lot of times people say, can't we just move on from that? And I do think that it's a perfectly valid response to an experience to say, I don't have closure on that, but I'm ready to move on. So it wasn't until much later, in fact, during the spring pandemic of 2020, when I had a lot of home time on my hands, that I was pulling the story back together. And I don't know if you feel this as a narrator, but somehow this is going to sound too new agey, but I felt I was channeling something, meaning, it's time. Channeling is an odd way to say it, but it's sort of like a timing thing in your psyche where you say, now's the time to do this. Yes. Right? That the story is congealing at this point. And I think the pandemic, especially the early stages of it, I literally, wrote out a last will and testament. I didn't think I was going to survive. I didn't know. I think we all felt quite vulnerable and quite transient on this earth at that time. And so I felt, I want to get this story out before I go, before I leave this mortal coil. It's time to at least tell this story. And so it did take a while to get to the healing of it. But I think that was about the time, during the spring of 2020, when I said, these are stories of healing. These are stories about, and healing, I think if you know the etymology of that word, it means just wholeness, bringing things whole again, right? You have a cut on your hand, it heals, it's whole again. And I think, losing a family member, or losing even a love relationship, or losing anything, losing a job, I mean, it creates a sense of loss and a hole in us. And how we kind of heal, I think it's a miraculous and wonderful thing. So I think that was the moment when I felt, okay, this is a good thing to do, for myself, for the relationship with my parents, several years gone, and just bring it all together and have it as a form of closure.
Yeah. As a linguist, you were dealing with channeling or feeling that it was the right time to tell this story, how to tell the story, the layers of the story. You talked about dreams and how they were connected with what was happening in there within your experience. As a linguist, you used different languages. Not you used different languages of the places that you had lived in maybe in Japan and other places. You also used the language of dreams. There were animals in the dreams, the chickens, snake, octopus, things like that. And then there was the language of using different words to help describe the story you were talking about. Can you talk about your use of different languages and the codes and how that helped you tell this story?
Well, yeah, I think that was another aspect of the storytelling, is that there are multiple codes, running through the story. One of them, I mean, the instigation for the story itself was, the early experiences with my mother when she started to experience Alzheimer's, and realizing that there were, language as you and I are using it now was no longer possible with her. That we had to invent a new language that was less verbally dependent, right? Because there are certain areas of the brain that are affected by Alzheimer's that prevent lucid use of language. But other parts of the brain are still quite alive, and thus, connections to the soul and the heart. So I realized that I would need to find new languages and give up old languages when I'm with her, and feel that that's okay. It's not a loss of language, it's a new code. And I felt that started to resonate with other experiences where I was in situations where I was not a native speaker. And I felt pretty much like the person with dementia, limited use of the brain because I didn't have access to the language that the people were using. And this harkened me back. In one chapter, I talk about this, where I was in the Peace Corps right after college in West Africa. And the local language is Ewe, West African language that goes Niger Valley. And one of the acquaintances I made in Togo, where I was, it turns out he's a bartender. It's this small bar on the beach in Lomé, Togo. But he befriended me early on in my experience there. And, he was teaching me Ewe over drinks. But, he said, Michael, in the story, I'm named Gabriel, but, I said, Mr. Michael, you have to learn everyone's native language, or you simply can't have a relationship with them. And, and I think that is it seems like a truism to me now, but at the time it was like, wow, that's right. That if you don't at least appreciate the person's native language, the language in which they feel most themselves, right? Yeah. How can you say you have a relationship with someone? So, my mother was losing English, American English as she knew it, so fluently throughout her life. And I'm sure she felt that sense of loss, that this tool is no longer available to me. But learning that she had a new language, and it was equally rich. I think that's the thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that every language is equal, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's connected. Everybody has a native language that's connected to their soul. And I think that my mother had to, she was learning the new language herself. And I think she appreciated when other people around her, and there were many brilliant caretakers who understood this in their own way, that, when we communicate with her, we're in a new language. It's very much like speaking Ewe, and you only know a few words to begin with, and you learn a few more. And I think the joy of discovering the new language is something that I wanted to convey to readers and listeners as well. It's that we often think of language learning as a painful thing, but it's a joyous thing as well. I mean, enlightening that you can
the discovery,
learn. The
can be
discovery.
a great gift. Yeah, the discovery of it is it's
Yeah.
something to celebrate.
And another aspect of the code part of the story, I mean, it shows up in that episode I was talking about, the inheritance and visiting the cafe with my father, is that and I think a lot of men in all societies, but it's just taking, American society, Midwest American society where I grew up, and my father, fought in World War II, and his father fought in World War I, kind of a nation of warriors, a family of warriors, learn how to speak in codes, which means disguise your real feelings, especially the men. There are certain things that are taboo. We don't talk about them. And those would be vulnerabilities. We don't talk about our vulnerabilities. We don't talk about actually even new discoveries. We don't talk about things that are outside the pattern that got us here. And I think there's a certain amount in every family that I've come across of this kind of, we have secrets. Not that they're taboo secrets or, dark secrets, but there are certain things we keep to ourselves. And I call this, Jake's rules in the book, my grandfather's rule system, that he propagated through us. And, to me, it's just an amusing aspect of our family is that we had this set of rules, particularly among the men. I mean, I talk to my sisters and they say they have their own version of it as well, but it comes down to a kind of a survival ethic. And I think part of storytelling, particularly when you're in vulnerable topics, you start to scratch into the codes that people keep secrets in. And you kind
and
of
in the book, how dare you be brave enough or punk enough to actually speak that to your father, to ask him about Jake's rules, and for him to acknowledge that, yeah, I guess there are rules, and to even just